Welcome back to Screenfish Radio. I'm thrilled that you could join us this week as we are talking about Joel Coen's The Tragedy of Macbeth. We're getting highbrow here. We spoke about Scream last week. This week, we're talking about Shakespeare. Very similar. And I am so excited this week to have with us two educated gents, friends of the show. I'm so glad to have Victor Stiff and Dave Voigt back with us. Welcome back, guys.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey.
I'm thrilled that you would join me. I thought maybe I would film this in black and white, but I couldn't get the filter on my Zoom properly set up. So
it's got to be 4:3 as well. So, you know,
that'd be 4:3 ratio. Yes, that's right. But each one of us will have the opportunity to have a grand monologue at some point during this as well. We'll all take turns. The Tragedy of Macbeth is the latest version of Shakespeare's Macbeth, which tells the story of a Scottish lord who becomes convinced by a trio of witches that he will become the next king of Scotland. His ambitious wife will do anything to support him in his plans of seizing power. And as those balances of power begin to shift, the two begin to sink into madness and the country of Scotland into chaos. But as always, this podcast is rated S for spoilers, which is a little bit odd to say for a play that's been written about 500 years ago. But in case you haven't seen it, just so you're aware. But gentlemen, let's start off. Let's talk about Shakespeare a little bit here before, and get to the film. What is it about Macbeth or Shakespeare that continues to resonate? What do you think?
Well, the reason that Shakespeare is so timeless is he just attaches his stories to these very primal human themes that we can all relate to. So if you look at a movie from 2021 like Drive My Car, great movie, great story, that's not really something everyone wants to sit through, right? It's a 3-hour movie about a man like, coming to terms with his emotions. Shakespeare is about love, it's about hate, it's about ambition, it's about deception. These are like very visceral things that never go away. We've all dealt with at some point in our lives. And he, in the introduction, you said we're going highbrow talking about Shakespeare, and that's really changed over the years because Shakespeare in his prime, it was lowbrow humor. He was like the Farrelly brothers version. He played to the masses. He wasn't trying to be too smart for everybody. So he went for what works. He hit us on a level that everyone can relate to, and he didn't try and get like too ambitious with it, although we see it that way now.
No, I mean, it's the raw human experience. It's not trying to fancify. It's not glossing over anything. It's man versus man, woman versus woman. I hate you, you hate me. Love, passion, hate, revenge, despair, all that fun stuff wrapped up into a package, which is why, again, this material always still resonates, because it gets to the core of who we are as people. But like Victor said, I mean, these are all things we've had in our lives. They're all emotions we can relate to, and they're all emotions that we will still be able to relate to 100 years from now, when the three of us are, being held, by someone, so with our skull being held by someone while delivering a soliloquy or a monologue.
Alas, poor Dave. I knew him, Victor. It's amazing to me, though, that we've latched on to him. Like, he's certainly not the only playwright, but he's one of these ones that, I mean, Macbeth can be remade. Romeo and Juliet can be remade, any number of times and eras and ways, and it still seems to deeply connect. And you're right, there's this base human connectivity that comes out of his characters, which is so fascinating to me. And yet each presentation of it can be entirely different. Like there's something so culturally set in a Shakespearean presentation, but the play itself is, well, it is the thing, but the play itself continues to stay the same. I find it fascinating. You know, it's funny, I was thinking about this week too, with, hear me out, Death on the Nile. Because I'm wondering, again, with Agatha Christie, you know, her that novel was written in 1937. We see a modern remake 2022, and sure, it's a period piece, but it still connects. It still connects in terms of its resonant themes. It's really interesting.
Well, these people are making essentially popcorn flicks, right? One of the reasons Marvel's movies are so popular all around the globe is you don't have to have a nuanced understanding of the English language to relate to it. Like you could watch Avengers with the sound off and still realize what's going on, right? So they're not trying to get too highbrow with what they're saying, and you can just appeal to everybody on a very just, I need to sit down and kill 2 hours and have fun. Like that's what they're going for, and it works.
So it is, I'm just asking a question here. I honestly don't know if this is true or not, but I mean, today when we talk about the arts, you know, or do we treat that, like you said, like this was lowbrow entertainment? Are we shooting too high? Like, are the stories that last the ones that are the simplest?
Yes.
Hmm.
I mean, I forget who said it, but what's the old adage? There's really only 6 or 7 or 8 stories out there, like, ever, and they're all just adaptations thereof. I mean, in the reality is there are no new stories to tell. It's how you tell them, which is what makes it so compelling.
Yeah, if you go beat for beat, Harry Potter is very similar to Star Wars. If you look at the hero's journey, like we see it in almost every movie. There's not really many new things to say. It's just a matter of how you get people to relate to the characters.
Yeah, I think it was it Joseph Campbell that talks about the seven primary stories or something to that effect.
I think it was Joseph Campbell. I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. Like there are so many, like, oh man, and it's funny. I hear people say, "Oh, I'm so sick of the hero's journey," but we've been telling it for, you know, infinite centuries. It's a good thing we're tired of it now. You know, it's like,
well, if you take a popcorn flick and it has that hero's journey template and you shift everything even by like 5 to 7 minutes, people in the audience will start to get bored. They'll start to think it's slow. Like we're just so conditioned to absorb that, whether we know it or not.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, shifting away then a little bit, I'm thinking out loud here. Are there stories right now or in the last 20 years that you think people will be talking about in the next 70?
That's a hard one.
That's a hard one because, I mean, at the end of the day, and I mean, this even almost goes contrary to what we all do, it's going to be subjective. Because, I mean, something like Drive My Car, again, which Victor brought up, I mean, it's a beautiful movie and it's this fantastic story and you get wrapped up in it. But I mean, again, it's also 3 hours and it's got a certain pace to it. And if you're not ready for that pace, then it's not going to be as compelling. There may be audiences who would be more sort of wrapped up into the raw emotion of a marry me or something like that, where it's, you know, oh my god, I married the wrong guy, and then, you know, that kind of thing. It's at the end of the day, I think what's most important is that we live in a world right now where these stories can be told, and we live in a world where there's enough artistic freedom for there to be slight variations or things to be done a little differently. I mean, I look at something like Compartment Number 6, which, you know, it's a fantastic movie, but it's not an original story. It's just the subtle nuances they put on how they tell the story is what makes it memorable.
I'd like us both, or all of us, to recognize here, mark the day that Dave Voigt said that we'll be talking about Marry Me 70 years from now.
Well,
I'm
this
going to
writer,
hell for saying that. I know it.
there's a writer named Chuck Klosterman, and he has a book called What If We're Wrong? And essentially what he does is look at our views now and try and estimate what we'll still believe in the future, because we have this bias that we're the peak of civilization. Everything we're doing now is the best way to do it. People felt that way in the 70s. People felt that way in the 50s. And it's like, you couldn't tell a person in 1940 that smoking while you were pregnant was bad. Now we look at those people like they were cavemen. So what are people going to be looking back at us and thinking we got way wrong? And he's a pop culture writer, and he really does go into how the things we assume are going to be what translate likely won't be what translate. So if you think of, there was thousands of artists performing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. How many do we know? We know Marilyn Monroe, we know the Beatles, but, there's usually some sort of cultural shift we can't predict that makes that thing the thing. So we assume Marvel movies, people are going to be watching them 70 years from now when they only remember, I don't know, maybe 5 movies from the decade, but there's a really good chance it could be something like Twilight or, just the least expected thing.
Oh, that would be tragic.
I mean, how many things do we all consider classics across various genres or platforms or whatever that when they first came out flopped? And I mean flopped. There's a lot of them.
It's a great point. I'm sorry, Victor, I think you're going to say.
Well, if Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart go on to become the biggest movie stars in the world, right, of their generation, people will look back at Twilight a lot differently than we kind of wrote it off. And I think also as critics, there's a cultural divide where a lot of critics believe that something that's popular can't be good. We were kind of talking about this before the show, right? And it's like, you don't give the mainstream thing the credit it deserves in I don't know, highbrow spaces, but like what James Gunn does with Guardians of the Galaxies is hard. Like, it's really hard. It's easy to wash it off as it's not cinema, it's a theme park, but to like take characters nobody knows and make the audience connect with them and tell a compelling story and also make like $700 million at the box office. Like, why can't that be in the conversation for best movie of the year, right? Other than, everybody likes it, so it can't be good.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I know that like we joke about the Oscars. I admit I love the Oscars because they're so silly, and I love the pageantry. That's what I love about them, but how many times do we have a conversation every year pretty much of they got it wrong? Almost every year it's they got it wrong. There are a few exceptions. There are some, like, for example, again, the Shakespeare one, with Gwyneth.
Oh, Shakespeare in Love.
Shakespeare in Love. Thank you. Shakespeare in Love takes Best Picture, snubs Saving Private Ryan. 25 years later, people still talk about that. There are films like The Social Network. The year The Social Network went up against The King's Speech, and it became a big cultural thing. Citizen Kane didn't get Best Picture, but everybody thinks of it as the greatest film of all. Well, not everybody. Many think of it as the greatest film of all time, and these are not the films that take home the gold. And nobody, I can't say nobody. I don't remember. Is it How Green Is My Valley that took Best Picture that year? I don't even remember.
I'd have to look it up.
It was over Citizen Kane, and you don't see a lot of people arguing the merits of How Green Is My Valley if that's the film.
Well, movies are art. Art reflects life, and the thing about life is to understand it requires context, right? So if you're standing in front of a painting and you have your nose pressed against the painting, like that's the social media frenzy of a new movie coming out. This is all you see. But over time, you kind of see the cultural relevance of something, you understand it, you sit with the film more, and all of a sudden you're standing like a block away looking at this, massive billboard, and it all makes sense. So it's kind of weird that we're judging art, especially the critical darling movies, they all come out in the back end of the year. So it's the movies we're seeing in October, November, December are the ones that are getting nominated for the awards. And it's like, you really don't have time to process them, especially as critics. You're getting slammed with, dozens of screening requests a day. And you're just like, you're not watching these things as they're meant to be experienced. And it really, from our end, it shifts our perspectives about what's good and what's important and, even, what's fun to watch.
And just put a little perspective on that. It's February right now, and we're getting slammed with dozens of screening requests per day. Think about how it is in October and November.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love, Victor, what you said just about perspective, because, I mean, especially when it comes to award season. And I mean, I will admit this opinion of mine has evolved over time the more I've done this job, is that the nomination is the award. And that's how really it should be perceived. Whoever gets the little gold trophy and whoever gets to make a speech, who the hell cares?
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's not a marker of who's better or who's worse. It's just, it's just another part of the industry that we sort of go with. And I mean, it's nice to have sort of the marker of the nominations for the general public to go, oh, I should go see that. Oh, they say, oh, blah, 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 blah. But it's not a question of so-and-so is better than so-and-so. It never has been, and it never will be.
Yeah, it's a great point. Well, I mean, with that being said, gentlemen, I mean, let's turn our attention to the tragedy of Macbeth. Because I think what you've made are some great points. And I think this is such a broad conversation. And here we have, like I said, a film that was popcorn film or popcorn theater when it was created. And now it's viewed as more highbrow entertainment. So what did you think of the tragedy of Macbeth?
Such a Coen movie. It just falls right into the wheelhouse. It's bleak, it's eerie, it's cynical. It's one of the darker movies they've ever made, in a filmography filled with dark movies. It's just so rich and atmospheric. I'm kind of over the Macbeth story. I've been experiencing it since I was in high school. I didn't need to see it again, but I really enjoyed just sitting back in the theater and soaking up their version of this world. It's just so immersive.
I mean, I would contradict that a little bit. I would go against that because, and I mean, something you talked about before the show went on, just how does this film sort of lend to the Coen legacy? And I would actually argue that it doesn't, because when we think Coen legacy, we think Coens. This is Coen singular. And to me, in watching this felt, as much as there are some of those elements of the bleak and sort of like the stark imagery and just sort of the way that they framed and shot it. I mean, yeah, there was a lot of it where even when I was watching this adaptation of Macbeth, I almost thought, oh, wow, they pulled that from Blood Simple, or they pulled that from such and such, or they pulled that from Miller's. It still felt very separate from what we know as the Coen brother canon. Because as much as we may think like Miller's Crossing and Blood Simple and all of those other great movies, there's also Buster Suggs, there's Big Lebowski, there's different ways into sort of thinking what is Coen. And to me, this is very much Joel trying to sort of break out of that and do something maybe a little bit different, but still maintaining some of the sensibilities that he's picked up over the years working with his brother.
Yeah, I like the term sensibilities that you said there, because I don't know if, I think I sort of fall between the both of you here. I didn't think it was the most Coen movie I'd ever seen. I also didn't think it was that different. Like in term, what intrigued me about it too is that in the Coen, the first thing that attracted me to Coen's work wasn't their visuals. It was the beat of their dialogue. There's a very Coen beat to their dialogue in so many of their films where, and I would say almost Shakespearean, but maybe that's the wrong phrase, but I think works well with Shakespeare, where there's just the way they expect their dialogue to be given. And thank the Lord Denzel didn't actually try to do a British accent. I was like, I was waiting for some sort of poor accents across the board. They didn't do it. They just let people do it, but they didn't need to, because there's that beat to the language. And the visuals are one thing. The visuals are, oh my gosh, the visuals in this are gorgeous. It's just, it is a treat to watch. And just the way, even that most, just so much of it is gray. And the lights and the darks, they sort of bleed one way or the other, depending on the scene. Oh, it is a treat to watch. And I mean, some of the shots are very Coen's, like they love their close-ups, they love this stuff. But I at the same time, I didn't feel like it was a true film, because knowing it was just one of them there. And I don't know if he was trying to break free of it, but you certainly see some of those sensibilities in this particular film.
I mean, they love a doomed protagonist, don't they?
They do. Which, you know what, in thinking of that, this has probably been something that, I look at it and say, oh, well, what were they just sitting around deciding they're gonna, make a Shakespeare? But it may have been coming from some time, because maybe the influences of a play like this have shaped so many of their stories beforehand.
Well, I mean, I think with this you realize, but I mean, a lot of this also has to be, this credit has to be given to Frances and just her training and like sort of the stories she wanted to tell. And I mean, I do, as much as it just says Joel Coen, I would dare say this is a, co-directed by Joel and Frances joint, as opposed, more than anything else. There is definitely sort of a sense of wanting to put a presentation on like this that feels different, that feels unique. And I mean, just to go back to sort of the visual style of the film, I mean, I love the framing of it, and I love just that it's basically like, it's almost presented like, one of those things that airs at Cineplex where they show a play on the big screen. Like, it's filmed almost in that style. But the Coens, be them together or Joel separate, they've never made an ugly movie in their life. Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, Bruno Dubel, who did the cinematography here, does such a fantastic job. And I mean, if you look back through the entire Coen canon, I mean, how much they've worked with Deakins and how much they've worked with other people like that. To me, this is about Joel, and I mean, maybe even Frances, who wanted to make her own movie, quote unquote, trying to give the presentation of Macbeth and trying to give the presentation of Shakespeare something almost classical in a way. Because like I said, this does feel like we're we have a seat on the stage while they're doing the play, as opposed to sort of being an audience member in a movie theater kind of thing. This feels very much immersed into the play itself, as opposed to being immersed into just the story.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was one of the things I loved about this. It is the most cinematic play I've seen in a long time. And in the sense that, like, everything about it felt false is the wrong, I mean, I'm saying that incorrectly, I know that, but it felt theatrical. Maybe that's the better way to say it. Like, it felt like they were in sets. Everything was intimate. It was close, even on the broader sets, the smoke and the fog that rolled in kept everything tight. I don't know if there's a scene where there's more than 10 people on screen. Even up into the battle scenes, like it feels like you're watching a play unfold. And I really felt, but at the same time, I felt like this was something, it felt sort of expansive at the same time. I don't know.
It managed to be big and intimate at the exact same time, which is what made it so unique.
Yeah, it doesn't try and hide that it's a play, right? Like it wears what it's conceived on its sleeve, but it does it so stylishly, and they're so pragmatic about the way they frame shots that it doesn't matter. It kind of it reminds me of do you remember, this is a weird reference, but on the Cosby Show, when they would do the dream sequences and everything was kind of like made out of cardboard and it had like a kid appeal. Like, it wants you to know you're watching a play, but we're going to show you a play in a way you've never seen it before. And I thought that was really fun.
Well, you could argue Bill Cosby is a Macbeth play in and of itself, but that's another story.
That's a whole other podcast.
That's a whole other episode. But no, here, oh my goodness. That I think this was what I loved about it most. They could have gone, and I know this isn't really Coen-esque, but they could have gone full Braveheart. The broad landscapes and the massive scope to it. Let's show Scotland in its glory. They don't do that. It feels like you're, well, I love this idea, the front row seat at a live stage production is just wonderful.
But I mean, really, when you think about it, because they couldn't go full Braveheart with this, because I mean, Macbeth is the bad guy.
Yeah.
When really you're gonna have to argue about that. I mean, and the intensity of the close-ups works. And I mean, it's one of those things where it felt very much designed visually to let the actors do the work. Whereas, I don't know if either of you guys saw it, but there was a Macbeth adaptation from a couple of years ago. It was with Fassbender, and Marion Cotillard was in it.
Oh, I didn't see that one.
It plays a little bigger, but it plays almost sort of in a smoke-filled kind of ethereal sense where, they're on the plains and there's blood and spatter everywhere. And then there's like close-ups while they're, giving, soliloquies to one another and then back and forth. It plays differently. This plays very much, let's create a perfect space for the actor to do the work rather than trying to create an environment.
I have seen the Polanski version. That was something else. No, and actually, what, having said that, I would say too, that I was particularly impressed with Denzel, and that's not shocking to say. Denzel is fantastic in everything he does. But this, I've seen him in interviews, and this was an incredibly different sort of process for him because he likes to be in the moment. He likes to ad lib. He likes to create his own dialogue. He was talking about Training Day and how much of that was just like him improvising. And they asked him, so what was this like? He's like, you can't do that with Macbeth. This is just his response. Because there's a different type of focus when you have to get this language correctly. The relationship with the text would be different than anything else.
I mean, Denzel has done a lot of theater over his career. He's done a lot of Shakespeare. I think he might have even been discovered doing Shakespeare, but I'm really interested in what kind of reverence he has working with Joe Coen, just because, Denzel is Denzel. He's one of those actors like Will Smith where he brings his Denzelness to every character. And, people in interviews did stress that they didn't let Denzel rely on his usual tics and his habits. So I'm curious, like, what a typical Denzel Shakespeare performance would look like versus this one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I didn't realize that. So then there would have been much more of a conversation between him and Coen. Say, okay, you usually do it this way, and you've done well, but let's try and do it this way. Would be very interesting to know how that worked out.
And based on her history and her training, I dare say Frances probably had a lot of say in that as well.
She's fantastic.
It is an intriguing performance just because, one, the age. I don't think they've ever done Macbeth where they've been people, in their 60s. It's always been much more younger, ambitious people. But there's a wariness to Denzel that you don't see in his performances. He's such a strong figure. He speaks from his chest. He's very powerful and masculine. And in this, there's a part of him that was just so withered and beaten down in a vulnerability we don't normally see in his characters.
Well, and I mean, specifically to that, because I remember in the interviews, there was, I think, one or two lines that they had to change that Frances made reference to, because obviously neither character was of childbearing age. And there are definitely a few cutting lines, definitely towards the end of the film, about sort of Lady Macbeth's inability to bear children. And they had to sort of adjust and change course a little bit along that front. But no, you're right. It's having these two characters definitely being past that age that we're traditionally used to seeing them adds an extra layer to the performances as well, because it really makes them, I guess, maybe feel almost more tragic in a way, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't considered that, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, there's more of a it's more of an act of desperation, right? Because they're grasping on to the last remaining years, and they're trying to define their legacy at a time when it's waning, and they're, you know, dealing with their mortality, versus a younger, up and coming, ambitious person. It really does put a different spin on them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I mean, there's the question then, gentlemen. Like, one of the more notable things to this film, to me, is the slight alteration in the title. This is not Macbeth. This is the Tragedy of Macbeth. So I would ask you, I mean, this is a famous play. It's been done many, many times. We, you know, not talking about necessarily a literary study, but what is the Tragedy of Macbeth?
Well, I mean, and not to get literal, but there is a tragedy of Macbeth, because when you think about it, the actual stage play of Macbeth is significantly longer than the material that's here. They have cut out quite a bit of material and made it a bit more streamlined. And I mean, I do think this does get read or get presented as the tragedy, quote unquote, of Macbeth as itself. But I mean, just to speak to what you were saying, like, what is the actual tragedy? I mean, I think it just goes to sort of the old adage of absolute power corrupting absolutely. I mean, it's that need and that sort of desire when people want to hang on to power or sort of thrust themselves into a position of power, they will scratch, claw, and want to hold on to it by any means and do some, you know, crazy things. I mean, if you believe what's to be heard with our neighbors to the south, you know, the toilet at the White House is getting clogged up with classified materials, you know, and that kind of goes along to that kind of idea that when you're in power, you will do as much stupid crap as humanly possible to stay there.
Yeah, I wondered that. It's interesting that you know, a film like this is remade now. No, it's not new. I mean, there was a Fassbender one a few years back, even just that. But you know, the timeliness of a film about the fall of power, or the corruption of power and one man's fall, that I think it certainly works in terms of certain political conversations which are taking place.
Oh, and you know, Joel and Francis definitely had that in mind as well as they were putting this together. So yeah,
for sure.
In many ways, it's much more of a statement along those lines of things than maybe sort of the I guess the blunted quote unquote satire of something like Don't Look Up.
We're back to Don't Look Up, which, based on our earlier conversations about popularity, will win Best Picture. That is what or be the one we're talking about in 40 years. Victor, what do you think?
Which question?
What about the tragedy? The tragedy.
I mean, maybe I'm just cynical because I've been seeing this story since I was 15 years old, but I never feel like he's a sympathetic figure. I see that ambition in him and that cunning in him right from the start. And I don't think it's tragic to see someone who is already somewhat of a bastard become a bigger bastard. So maybe I'm misreading something, but to me, maybe like it's a tragedy of human nature, but the tragedy of Macbeth, I don't know if I agree with that.
If anything, it's a tragedy that he felt the need to be a bastard.
Yeah, that's interesting. See, and I would argue, like, that I hear what you're saying. At the beginning of the play, I don't think he's that bad. Personally, I mean, I look at him and I'm like, here's a guy who's like, he's told by 3 witches that he's going to get power. Hey, that sounds pretty good.
No, that's where you mess up right there. you don't cut deals with witches unless you already have a bit of a problematic side.
Maybe my mistake.
And I mean, I forget what it is, but I forget the exact line. But I mean, towards the beginning of the film, where the king's men come in, we're going to reward you with the title of such and such, and it's like, well, but he's still alive. Where are his clothes? Why haven't you given this to me already? Why are you giving me the title of a man who isn't dead yet?
Yeah.
There is that sort of that needling from Macbeth to want to be like, hey, I deserve more than this. What's going on? What are you doing? What's, blah 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 blah. we do get the sense very early on that he is not a nice guy.
Hmm. Well, but I would certainly say he's ambitious. But remember, he tries to back out of it. He does try to back out of it.
Only when it's too late, though.
No.
Uh,
She says to him, you know, are you a man? And at one point he says, you're only going to bear male sons because that's all you have within you is this thing. Because she basically smacks him around and says, get on with it.
well, but I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, really, the ultimate villain in this is Lady Macbeth, not Macbeth.
Yeah, it's true. This film does a wonderful job of showing the transition, I think.
Yeah.
I thought that was really well done. I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, he's father of the year. I mean, he has no kids, but I'm not saying that he should be nominated for, you know, the Lady Byng trophy in the NHL or something as the nicest guy on the planet. But I don't know. I think for me, the real tragedy is just that this person, when tempted, when you know, you say absolute power corrupts absolutely, it's the temptation of power, I think, that pushes him over the edge. You know, it's sort of like, oh, this could happen. I'm afraid to lose that opportunity. How do I make sure this takes place? You know, who do I have to? Oh, really? Oh, I got to kill him. Okay, and his kid. Like, oh, okay.
And they kind of touch on this in Game of Thrones, where it's, you know, the person who should have the power is the one who refuses to chase it.
Yeah,
that's a great point.
And I mean, that's a lesson that can be applied throughout human history, really. Which again goes back to the original question of why is Shakespeare so universal and still so timely, because these stories don't go away.
Yeah. It is amazing how often we see stories similar to this play out in real life. You know, 500 years later and probably 500 years from now.
Yeah.
The base of human emotions is often the most raw, no matter how far you change and grow and evolve.
Yeah, I mean, we've all worked with someone who was maybe a little too ambitious, that it was problematic, and we've all been around people, bosses who are afraid everyone's coming for their jobs. Like, we can all relate to the Macbeth scenario.
Yeah, it's true. Oh man. So are we saying there's a little bit of Shakespearean characters in all of us? That's a terrifying thought.
Oh, but it's accurate. It's absolutely accurate. I mean, if anything, why Shakespeare's material and even this particular play specifically still resonates is because it takes the mirror and puts it back on ourselves. And I mean, and how much pain and suffering and hatred have come throughout human history because of our own inability to be honest with ourselves.
Yeah, it's true. Or listening to the wrong people.
Yeah,
you see in this one particularly. Wouldn't be much of a play if he you know, listened to Banquo.
Well, there's that.
Move on. Hey, the guy's staying here for the night. Oh, that's nice. Oh, great. Okay, goodbye. The play is over. But no, it's true. Who we listen to shapes and shifts those things as well, or can do that as well as safest voices.
Yeah, and people will believe the most wild things if you're telling them what they want to hear.
Yes.
Too. Right, that's another thing. We're vulnerable to the things we want people to tell us. I think Red Rocket does a really good job of depicting that. You know, someone just saying the most unbelievable things. They have no moral standing whatsoever. But if it's flattering to you, you're going to buy the big lie.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially at a time like this, you know, with and we can tune in and tune out of the voices we want to hear. Forget people just on social. You know, it's so much easier to validate toxicity when you have the opportunity to ignore, the people you don't want to hear. I'm just like in pause out of this conversation. This is interesting.
See, popcorn flicks are deep. You know,
It's true.
Well, Screenfish is that kind of site, man. We're getting into it, you know.
Oh man, yeah, well, this is great. Ironic.
Okay, I have a question for the group.
Go ahead.
Off the top of my head, I don't think the Coens have ever done a legit horror movie, and this film it felt like it was taking place in a nightmare or an alternate dimension. And I'm wondering, like, are you interested in seeing the Coens take on a full-blown horror flick?
No, because I prefer sort of the nuance and interesting layers that they can bring to something. Because I mean, you could argue that something like A Serious Man might have been a horror movie, or I mean, I could go through a couple of others just off the top of my head, but again, they've never been storytellers to do anything really in a straight ahead line. Like, I mean, Lady Killers, you could argue, has some horror elements to it. Even No Country for Old Men. They've done so many stories that have so many different layers of nuance and sort of importance to the human experience in general, that, I mean, this may be even an unpopular thing to say, but you could argue that a lot of their movies are horror movies, because I mean, Lady Killers is obviously a remake, but that's a bad example. But I mean, you know, No Country for Old Men, I'm sorry, but you know, Javier Bardem's character as Anton Chigurh, I mean, he's not that far removed from a Michael Myers when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, the Coens are good at making the people are the monsters in their films. And, you know, like that wood chipper scene in Fargo stayed with me as much as anything I've ever seen in a Halloween flick, right?
Mm.
But if I recall, wasn't the last film in Buster Scruggs kind of like horror-ish? Or am I misremembering that? Like, I would love to see them actually do something with a ghost. I just feel like that would be the best movie ever made.
I would be intrigued by that myself. I mean, ultimately with them, you're going to get something offbeat, which is exactly what I'd like to see. I don't want to see them make the third Halloween movie. I don't want to see that. But I mean, you might get something closer to David Lowery's Ghost Story, or something like that, which could be fantastic. What is horror to them? You know, like you said, that you've both said that there's influences throughout their works, and it shows up. I think there's such an influence on character in their work that actions like the woodchopper become more horrific than Halloween, where you have a guy trudging through town, you know, slaughtering people left, right, and center.
I mean, the scariest horror movies work because they make you're invested in the characters, right? And they're so great at making you care or worry about or think about even just deplorable people. I would just love to see the kind of tension they would build out of your typical horror scenario. I'm sure they would flip it on its head in a wonderful way.
I think we can all agree that we want to see them make a Star Wars movie. I think, or Marvel. You know, I'm okay with that. Getting that Disney canon. They wouldn't last 4 minutes on set on a Disney production.
But imagine the movies they could make after they got that Disney check, though.
It's true. It's so true.
It's a good compromise.
Are they one of the few people that you would, or few filmmakers? I know generally they go together. They're, you know, but are they one of the few storytellers right now that can tell any story they want? Would you say, and still be viewed as, yeah, like box office potential? Like,
well, I think box office is the wrong word, but I would agree that they could basically make any kind of movie that they want. Because I mean, you've got to remember, I mean, it's not like they're all of their, like with the exception of maybe No Country and probably Fargo, it's not like you can say a lot of their movies have been these big financial windfalls,
Right.
but they can bring stuff in at a fixed or under budget. And so like they have the license to basically do what they want. I mean, there is a reality out there that if you can make a movie for under X amount of dollars and you've got a track record of turning a profit, which they do, not necessarily a huge profit, but a profit, that people aren't going to get in their way. And especially these days with sort of the demand for content, I mean, okay, maybe, you know, maybe no one's going to give them $200 million to do whatever they want, you know, to make Fargo 2 or that kind of thing. But, you know, Netflix will have no problem, you know, giving them $10-20 million, go make what you want and we'll put it out in 2 weeks, you know, or whatever.
It's, man, that's a fast turnaround.
Okay, but you know what I mean. Yeah.
But
Just over the weekend.
they're kind of like Soderbergh that way, where they can take a very small, intimate story and make it feel expansive and epic. Like his new movie, Kimmy, it's called.
Yeah.
It's like it mostly takes place in one room, but it's Hitchcockian, and it just, they know how to tell just such a wrenching emotional story with very straightforward. They don't need effects, they don't need action sequences, right? So they pretty much can do what they want. I don't see any studio turning the Coens away if they want to make a $5 million picture.
The thing that intrigues me about them is they don't have to make a Marvel movie or a Star Wars film. Like even Soderbergh, you mentioned Soderbergh there. Soderbergh, for all of his indie work, is able to continue to do it, I would argue, because he keeps making out oceans films or heist films every now and then. You know, he's done 4 of them. And then he did Logan Lucky. You know, it's like, oh, okay, we did these ones. So now I'm going to go out and I'm going to do, you know, Kimmy, or I'm going to do this smaller film. Now, I'm not arguing that, I guess I'm not arguing necessarily that he has to do those things to do it, but it sure makes his funding easier when he can throw in a popcorn flick every now and then. The Coens don't seem to need to do that.
Soderbergh can shoot movies on his iPhone. He has shot movies on his iPhone. You know, it's just when you've got storytellers who are on a certain level, the money is irrelevant because they're gonna make stories. I mean, case in point, Victor, I don't even know if you were there, but I mean, at TIFF with the recut of Kafka. I mean, it was insane, but it made sense, still in an insane way. And all he did was recut, you know, reacquire the negatives to an old movie and recut it, and black and white it. If a storyteller is operating on a certain level, they will have free license basically to do whatever they want.
Well, here's a question then for you guys, you know, as we start to wrap up, because I see our time is continuing on. Maybe what are the stories are the wrong questions. What about the storytellers people are going to be talking about in 100 years based on our film track record? Who are the storytellers you think we're going to be talking about?
I would, if I had to gamble, I would hope it's Spielberg.
Yeah. He was the first one came to mind for me as well.
Me too.
And again, popcorn. Now, not all of it. I'm not saying that, but he leads with it.
Yeah, again, he's a world-class storyteller. You know, he's in the top 1% of filmmaking talent that's ever lived. And people don't always give him the respect he's due because he makes Jurassic Park and E.T. But, you know, you can throw 100 directors at those films and they wouldn't be box office juggernauts. He's just, he has that magic. He's like whatever LeBron has in basketball, he has for filmmaking. And, you know, he can tell you a deeply profound, meaningful human story, or he can do something with aliens, and it's amazing every time.
And it's understanding the history of cinema as well. I mean, I would look at something like West Side Story. That, I mean, did the world need a remake of West Side Story? Absolutely not. But because Spielberg did it and turned it just enough on its axis, it made it into this fantastic experience, which will thrive alongside the original for years to come.
Are there others? I wondered about Scorsese. However, I don't know if he would be viewed in the same way.
See, Spielberg is optimistic. he embodies hope and joy and optimism and family. Scorsese's pretty dark. That might be harder for people to latch onto in the long run. I would think it might be another person who makes feel-good movies.
If Spielberg is John Ford, I would say Scorsese is like Orson Welles. They both have their place, they both have their reverence, but they're existing on different platforms and sort of in different worlds and telling different stories.
What about someone like a Jordan Peele? I've wondered about that. Because I think Jordan Peele, and I mean, we're just seeing, he's only done, I think, 3 films directed, or 3 or 4 at the most. But there's something about his stories that I think 10 or 15 years from now, once he's built up that career,
I think it's going to be I think it's too early to tell.
Too early.
Yeah. Again, you need that context, because Get Out, it wasn't just a movie, it was a moment in pop culture that's still reverberating today. You can feel it. So like lines from that film have become just commonplace language. Like you can refer to someone like Kanye West as being in the sunken place and everyone knows what you mean. And because he is doing such topical films that are also thrilling, it is Hitchcockian. But he has to knock out a few to show he can sustain it over decades before he'll be remembered, like a Spielberg or a Scorsese.
Because I mean, even going back to Jordan Peele, I mean, as much as I would argue that, and I mean, I don't disagree that something like Get Out definitely reverberated on such this unique pop culture level, I would argue that from a structural standpoint, something like Us is probably a better film than Get Out was. Just because, at least for my end, it created more of a world and sort of brought us into something a bit more expansive while still sort of maintaining a lot of the themes that he pulled from Get Out.
Yeah, that was one of the things I highlight about him, is I see him as being a person that's got more Get Out and Us's in him. I could be wrong. I thought that M. Night Shyamalan was going to have, Sixth Sense was going to be the first of many, many, many Sixth Senses. But I think we've seen a significant drop off in his work, even though it's continued. And I'm not saying that all his movies are bad, or I'm not hating on him when I say that, but I think that he has not achieved the peak that he had in his early career, again, except arguably with Split.
But I mean, and again, with M. Night Shyamalan, you look at sort of his body of work, as much noise as Sixth Sense made. If you talk with guys like us, what's the one M. Night Shyamalan movie we talk about more than Sixth Sense? It's Unbreakable. It's not always the first movie. It's the second, it's the third, it's the fourth movie where legacies start to get built. And I think that's, going back to Jordan Peele, I think this one that's coming out this year, I think that's going to be a real telling point. If Jordan Peele, with this new one that we're going to get this year, manages to either sustain or come up to even another level, then we're going to see something. I mean, people think, Steven Spielberg's first movie was Jaws. In reality, it was like his third or fourth.
Yeah, Close Encounters came before that. Which
it was Duel. It was the truck movie.
Yeah, because it was Duel, Sugarland, Express, something else, and then Jaws, and then Close Encounters.
Wait, he made Pineapple Express?
Shut up.
On that note, I'm going to reel us in a little bit. Guys, this has been amazing and super fun, and I could keep going on, but we are running out of time. So we should screen it or skip it. The Tragedy of Macbeth, screen it or skip it.
It is one of the best things I saw on the screen last year. It is 100% screen it.
Yeah, I recommend it with the caveat, like if Shakespeare isn't your thing, definitely you're going to want to skip it. It's not going to do anything to change your mind, but if you're open to it, it's a really good movie. Yeah, definitely screen it.
I think that's a great point. I mean, there are some people that are just going to say, I don't want to listen to that. And even when I watched it, like I did not see it in the theater. I watched it at home, but I turned on the subtitles because the Shakespearean language comes so fast. And it's been so many years since I've actually read Macbeth. I wanted to make sure I got it. However, it is absolutely stunning. I think going back to those awards, I think the nominations for cinematography and for Denzel they're bang on. I think they're well chosen, and I think it is absolutely fabulous. It is a fabulous film. It is definitely a screen it for me as well. So,
and you know what? I mean, this is something that Joel even said in interviews. This is a rare piece of cinema that, I mean, that has been made ever, really, that he thought, and I mean, and I would agree with him on this, it plays just as well as IMAX as it would on your iPhone. The power doesn't get diluted. I think that's where this film really works particularly well.
I wish that I had seen this in theater. This is one of the few times I've seen a film that came out on streaming.
It's still playing, kid. It's still playing.
Honestly, I may have to do that, because it really is something I wish I'd seen sort of immersively, because it's gorgeous. But gentlemen, thank you so much. Thank you again. Let's give you a chance. Shameless plugs. How can our listeners and our viewers connect with you,
Victor?
At Victor J. Stiff on Twitter and Instagram, and Victor Stiff Reviews on YouTube.
Excellent.
All right, well, and you can find me over at InTheSeats.ca for all the latest and greatest from the world of film, television, entertainment, the moving image, and everything else in between. And also on our podcast, In the Seats With, where we sit down with a wide variety of industry professionals and pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and conversational fashion.
Appreciate it. Yeah, both you guys have great content, both of you, and I hope that our people will absolutely check those out as well. And if you're looking for further tales told by an idiot, full of sound and fury signifying nothing, you can follow us at Screenfish. But you can also find more of our stuff at screenfish.net, and you can find us wherever podcasts are available. If you go to screenfish.net and go to the podcast page, you can download Fishing for More, which are some small group questions, you can help get the conversation started where you are about the film together. You can like and subscribe us on YouTube. Look for Screenfish on YouTube, where you'll find, again, lots of interviews with industry professionals and lots of amazing conversations with people just like Dave and Victor on Screenfish Radio, and we hope that you will do that. But gentlemen, this has absolutely been a blast, and I thank you for that. And for you at home, we started the conversation. This was Screenfish.